Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start the second panel of this afternoon. It is a great pleasure to welcome General Hofbauer. Especially, we're happy to have an Austrian dealing with maritime strategy and of a quality that's recognized by our German colleagues. This is not something that goes without saying. He is going to introduce the panelists himself. He has published on the topic on marine topics, various geostrategic aspects of the maritime space as well. General, I'd like to hand over to you. Dear Wolfgang, ladies and gentlemen, admirals, I'm very happy that you're all here at the Marine panel of the OMC Strategy Conference. In the next 1.5 hours, we're going to hear from a group of top panelists on maritime aspects strategy along the lines of a leading discipline in the area of international commons. And we're going to hear the marine view in general on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're also going to look at history, but on the other hand, also hear about concrete questions on the effects of the developments in the High North. I'd like to welcome the 5 panelists, our 5 speakers. I'm personally very happy that you're all here. First, Captain Pecher is going to talk on the historic developments of sea strategic thinking. Then he'll be followed by Rear Admiral Schneider. He will talk about sea strategies today, a special topic that the Deputy Commander of the Academy is here joining us. Then Captain Lieutenant Oldorf will deal with the question of the narrative as a new phenomenon in the thawing Arctic, and Commander Gegner will deal with the question of hybrid warfare on the sea. And in the end, once more, we will have the High North in our focus. Admiral Grimstad will present to us the Norwegian view and share some personal thoughts on sea naval strategy. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all of you for taking part here. I'd like to thank our organizers, the OMC, and for all the support that we have had to get the speakers to the panel here in Vienna. And I'd like to have a bit of a discussion of about 10 to 15 minutes, so I'll keep my introduction short. I'm not going to do more. I'd like to call on our first speaker and present our first speaker, Commander Dr. André Pecher. He joined the German Navy in 1992. And you can see he was on a submarine. He was a submarine officer. He's a graduate of the Canadian Joint Command and Staff Corps College. And after he worked in the German Chief of Staff, he actually he's now preparing for his new role as military attaché in South America. Commander Dr. Pecher and we have worked very well together on my book on modern sea power, and he wrote, just finished a PhD thesis on Friedrich Oskar Ruge, his life role as a Marine officer from 1914 to 1945. Commander.
Herr General Hofbauer, vielen Dank für die freundlichen Worte. Ich hoffe nicht, dass die Erwartungshaltung zu hoch gereizt ist.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be able to speak here. The sea is the high road of the globe. The sea is the parade ground of the nations. The sea is the romping place of the power of entrepreneurship for all the peoples of the world and the cradle of their freedom. He who has no part in the sea is excluded from the good things and honors of the world. He is our Lord's stepchild. Brigadier Peichle, ladies and gentlemen, the lines reproduced here originate from the German national economist Friedrich List from the early 1840s. So the message is quite clear and concise. The sea feeds us all. The sea is a bridge of countries and continents. It's a global highway of communication and freight transport. It is a space for innovation. It brings us prosperity, and it is the space where we can act peacefully. The sea belongs to the global commons, as we would now say, even in German. It belongs to all of us, and still you can't own it. And at the same time, we bear a great responsibility in using the oceans. So this area is very vulnerable, and the unrestricted free use of the oceans holds a lot of potential for conflict if our national interests run counter to it, or if non-state actors come onto the planet with the target to destroy. So this brings us to the seagoing strategic thinking and action. So in the following, I will take a cursory look at the historical lines of maritime strategy thinking until the present. Let me begin with two elementary definitions of seagoing strategic thinking for better understanding. Maritime power. Now, a maritime power is the potential and the will to use the maritime spectrum globally and permanently according to one's own interests. And maritime domination, on the other hand, is the use of appropriate means to make full use of a maritime area and its dimensions, and to restrict or deny its use by others. So in a graduated scaling of achieving this state, we talk about a matter of sea control. Now, when we talk about strategic maritime thinking, the concept of naval power and maritime dimensions of military and political trade, we must bear in mind that Alfred T. Mahan and Sir Julian Courbet's writings have had a lasting influence on our conceptual understanding of this. Theories of naval power already proven in ancient Greece, and the strategist and historiographer Thucydides has already tried to prove that prosperous trade and the achievement of political goals in war are inseparably linked. He talked about the possibilities and the limits of power to control the seas. However, such considerations were not formulated until the end of the 19th century, when the American thinker, naval officer Mahan, presented his work on the influence of naval power in history. His theories on naval war still represent the starting point for thinking about the constitution and effectiveness of naval power. An essential conviction was the aspect of the decisive battle on the high seas, in order to gain maritime power and bring about the effective annihilation of the opponent. In other words, an offensive approach. Nevertheless, Mahan did not present a closed concept of naval power as if a mathematical calculation could be used to calculate it. On the contrary, a calculation seems rather impossible, and so the evaluation of its success or failure and the role of the Navy in the overall structure of a foreign policy of a nation can only be measured in relative terms. This is all the more important because with the advent of the French Jeune École at the beginning of the 20th century, a complementary school of thought about naval power emerged that called Mahan's beliefs into question and rather relied on more defensive concepts. So complete control of maritime areas. Now with the use of submarines, torpedoes and mines at the beginning of the 20th century was no longer an absolute but only a relative military and political goal. So control could only be exercised temporarily. In contrast to Mahan, according to the British Julian Courbet, naval forces were not able to achieve such goals anyway. In his opinion, an overall approach was needed that took into account the dynamics of land warfare. Courbet thus adapted his naval war theory, and he said that you should either gain maritime power or to prevent your opponent from doing so. And secondly, to protect your own naval lines. So everything should be geared towards this. The decisive battle on the high seas can, in his view, be one such means, but it's not necessarily the most suitable means of winning a naval war. So this was the difference between Courbet and Mahan. His approach was more defensive and much more flexible. Mahan and Courbet, in their analysis, focused on naval power and naval control, domination. Both agreed that only by reaching this state would a state be in the fortunate position to take advantage of the benefits of the sea for unrestricted trade and transport by sea. substantial differences in both is the question of how the state of naval supremacy, or at least naval control, could be achieved and maintained. Corbett countered the emphasis on the decisive battle with a rather defensive approach in which he warned not to risk his own navy in a decisive battle while neglecting the many parallel tasks of naval forces. Mahan's thoughts and ideas on naval power had a lasting influence on the conceptual orientation of the US Navy until the 1950s. Corbett's analysis, on the other hand, influenced the Royal Navy's actions during the First and Second World Wars. As a German, I can only say, well, we should have studied him more intensively. The rise of aircraft carriers as a means of naval war, the increasing importance of the Air Force in the strategic context, and the introduction of nuclear weapons have permanently changed the theory of naval powers and its exercise. The nuclear option was now the ultimate means, the determining strategic factor in an intellectually continental military confrontation of the East-West conflict. The classic naval strategy, as part of a larger overall strategy, increasingly faded into the background. It was not until the 1980s that this changed, when this East-West antagonism was abolished. So the USA and Great Britain, since the 1990s, pursued a similar approach: control of the maritime straits, maritime presence, and strategic deterrence. Those were tasks of maritime powers, and these served to push through one's own interests, global stability and security, securing prosperity against a background of dependence on the sea, free trade, and compliance with international trade, sometimes with an interventionist character. Now let's take a look at the present. Against the background of the current security policy situation, the question of the relevance of these historical considerations for current strategic considerations might arise. Now, starting in 1990, the old certainties are no longer valid. Nothing seems the way it was anymore. The dimensions of naval forces have expanded considerably. Until 1990, there was still an understanding of 3 dimensions: air, surface, and underwater. But today, naval forces are confronted with 6 dimensions. There's now space, the electromagnetic spectrum, and cyberspace. New threats and dependencies emerged: fragile states, proliferation, terrorism, piracy, state and non-state actors, environmental pollution, climate change, migration, the vulnerability of communication links, and also the shifting the tectonic global power structures. So the list of topics seems incredibly long. Consequently, since the 1990s, it has been new in strategic thinking that the development of a maritime strategy is much more complex in view of the threat perceptions outlined. And political developments of tasks and range of applications, politics, economy, society, military, ecology, social conditions, international rules, and the development of new technologies and new phenomena are factors which, in addition to the developments outlined, must now be reflected in maritime strategy thinking in order to achieve unhindered access to the sea, peaceful trade at sea, and compliance with international law regimes at sea, as well as conflict resolution. Security and military strategies that work towards reaching these goals can occur within the framework of hegemonial or unilateral claims to power, but also in the form of global and regional systems of collective security or defense. Containment or isolationism, diplomatically deposited maintenance of a balance of power in a certain region, as well as selective engagement, can also emerge as a characteristic. Strategy here means the attempt to control processes and events, and even in peacetime, strategy is an important role as a planning reference, as a means to put political pressure, political lever, and a unifying moment. Today, therefore, holistic solutions must be found which combine or bundle all of these conceivable means and take into account all of these above factors. Whole of government approach, comprehensive approach, whole of nation approach, joint comprehensive approach. So these are a couple of buzzwords for these complex approaches in which the naval forces are no longer an exclusive means, but they have a wider range of capabilities and tasks. Consequently, we speak of a maritime strategy and not a naval strategy. So this is also reflected in the spectrum of tasks of naval forces, which has become more diverse, as classic naval warfare, stability and security tasks, cooperative tasks, all the way to police tasks, show of force or naval diplomacy, and this with fewer and fewer units. So what lessons can be learned from these admittedly scarcely presented lines of development with regard to naval strategic thinking? So what observations have been made over the past 30 years? Which trends are discernible in broad strokes? So, ladies and gentlemen, as an impetus for the ensuing discussion, I would like to present the following hypotheses or conclusions that will be discussed in the following. So, historically speaking, states have aligned their naval forces both offensively as well as defensively. This has now changed today. In the past 30 years, navies have been carrying out more and more missions of all kinds with different levels of intensity, much many more than ever before, with fewer and fewer units. And against the backdrop of budget cuts and the justifiable rationale of why increasingly expensive large military equipments are purchased, this also raises a question of a society's resilience. How well ready to defend are today's Western societies? Are they on a decline? Thirdly, naval forces are in a field of tension between a conventional naval strategy, which entails classic naval warfare and competes with other nations, and a cooperative maritime strategy in which the navies have a stabilizing, diplomatic and police tasks. Fourth, all states on this earth should actually have a common interest in peace at sea, free trade and consequently free access to the sea. Consequently, this requires a common understanding for the so-called global commons. But is that really the case? Does it not seem rather the case that there is currently a change taking place, a transformation? There are different ideas that prevail when one considers the development of the anti-access area denial A2, AD, for example, in the Chinese Sea, or maybe the developments in the High North, and hybridity. Hybridity is today a new buzzword which actually embeds asymmetrical modes or means of action. Hybrid and asymmetrical approaches have always existed in the history of naval warfare, but only at the tactical level. What's new in the case study Russia is that hybrid modes of action are integrated in an all-military operation, thus have a strategic character. Is this really a new phenomenon? And how to deal with it? 6. The dangers in cyberspace. Attacks are now also conceivably very realistic in the era of maritime cyber warfare. Cyber warfare can only be considered as a new discipline of the principal warfare areas. Or is there probably a completely new threat here, which cannot be countered with conventional military thinking and action because it has much more far-reaching consequences? Ladies and gentlemen, it was my intention to give a first impetus to thinking about the maritime dimension with the historical lines of development. So give it just a short impetus about the maritime dimension, and I hope that I have been successful. I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Captain. Our next speaker is Rear Admiral Carsten Schneider. He joined the Navy in 1974, graduated after studying economics and organizational sciences. He was actually deployed first on the speedboat Raya and then the frigates Bremen and Lübeck. Later, he was commander of the 4th Frigate Fleet, and in 2003, commander of the German-French Navy units. Admiral Schneider then actually worked in the planning in various positions at the ministry, and since 2012 he has been working at the academy, the Leadership Academy, and he's going to take us into the present. Thank you for your kind remarks. I would like to add one thing. It's not only that I'm happy to be here, but I consider it a great honor to be one of the panelists here and be part of this discussion in the German-speaking world. And I would like to thank you for the fact that I can talk about maritime strategy, not naval strategy, but strategy for the maritime space. And this is part of an overall strategy. Embedded in this, the naval forces that represent the strategy in the maritime space, and they also represent the maritime aspect in the armed forces. So this is an interesting connection. When I talk about the maritime space, I talk about the high seas and the oceans, and I'd like to make a few remarks on its characteristics. The high sea is what we call the global commons. They have already been mentioned, like the outer space and the information or cyberspace. And these spaces have to be looked at in a context at all times. The high sea is a space without any territorial sovereignty, but there is law, there is international law. It was only recognized that a certain order was needed on the seas, even if it did not belong to anybody's exclusive sovereignty, and this proved to be a very good option. Although the oceans are a space of permanent conflicts between states and non-state competitors, there is a legal regime that guarantees the peaceful use of the oceans for various kinds of interests and parties. The legal order on the sea, with the Third UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as its core piece, actually lives on the fact that the sea powers observe it and protect it. You cannot occupy seas, you cannot possess them. There are no people living there. And in the last 25 years, this tool of stabilizing operations could be used for. Here, no key leader engagement nor winning hearts and minds is useful. The power on the sea exists as long as it is physically present. The concept of the two classical forms of sea power, sea control and sea denial, remains up to date. Sea control means to guarantee that a certain space of the sea can be used for your own needs. Sea denial is the ability to deny it, sea control to an opponent. It is the weaker form of sea power. It is an old insight that it means a lot of expense, that it's expensive to exercise sea power, and only large countries can actually afford sea control. How far this is true for sea denial, we'll discuss later. The expense justifies based on the meaning in the word of Friedrich Fliss. It's the meaning that the nation gives to the sea. It's not restricted to military factors, but is a whole spectrum of range of activities that are important for the prosperity and well-being of the nations and of humankind altogether. I would like to mention just the most important ones. First of all, a large economic topic is sea trade, together with the fisheries, the oldest use of the seas. To protect the trade was the origin of sea power and navies. Germany alone trades yearly 245,000 tons of goods across the sea, a value of 450 billion euros. This is about 31% of its foreign trade in tonnage and about 25% of values. The prosperity of the country depends on the flow of these goods, and this is, of course, true for China and many other states around the world. What is not clear, however, is how sea trade will develop in long term in the future. If robots, artificial intelligence, and 3D printers will permit to actually move industrial production from low-wage countries back to older industrial nations. This will have an influence on the volume of sea trade, without any doubt. If goods so far were actually moved across parts of the world via many different stations, new procedures will allow it to put the raw materials together at the same place all the way to the final production. And this may mean that in the future the flows of goods across the oceans will actually reduce. China, in any case, with its new maritime Silk Road strategy, is actually focusing very much on the sea routes, although it's also trying to open up land routes. The transporting raw materials will continue across the seas. The second large maritime topic is the sea as a provider of raw materials and energy. Fishery as a provider of animal protein has reached a production maximum. Overfishing of the oceans creates worries and gets a lot of attention from the international community in order to curtail illegal aspects. Crude oil from the North Sea has already reached a peak and surpassed it, while in other regions of the world it's only starting. The supply of electric energy from tidal power plants and ocean thermal energy have a limited significance but may grow in the future. The increasing number of wind parks on the sea shows that the energy gained here is an important factor in the energy supply of large industrial nations. The economic significance of the seas and the oceans will be decisive how nations will be willing, to what extent, to invest into their influence on sea. The expansion of alternative energy sources on the sea is connected to climate change, that is again connected to the state of the oceans. Not all theses on climate change are undisputed, but it's clear that the oceans have a decisive role to play for the global climate, and the effects of El Nino and the currents based on El Nino and its effects on the climate in South America and other parts of the world are actually being discussed beyond the expert circles. As the owner of the house of only 2 meters above zero sea level, I'm interested in the rise of the ocean level as a consequence of global warming, and this is something I have in common with million people in this world, for example, in Bangladesh. The consequences of these changes in the oceans are of strategic importance for many nations. It depends on the question which influence humanity can take on these questions. There will influence politics in various nations. An interesting topic is the role of the oceans for the information space. In recent years, the vulnerability of sea cables has been discussed by experts. These sea cables are, of course, protected by international treaties, but there are growing concerns that certain nations may disregard these treaties. Internet depends on the large transoceanic cables, and seemingly accidental interference can cause great damage worldwide, and this is something we will have to observe. And this gets us to the military significance of the high seas. What is unchanged in the high sea? It is a great basis for military reconnaissance and intelligence. Specially equipped ships and airplanes can collect data legally, and the term spy ship or spy plane, that is actually wrong. It is a legal activity. This is also true for underwater station in one's own and in international waters. Next to the reconnaissance and intelligence, there are three aspects that I would like to mention on a military level. First, it is protecting one's own coast against military attacks from the sea. Second, it is the security of one's own ships on the sea in the energy of with energy related activities that needs to be guaranteed. And finally, the sea routes actually guarantee access to military operation areas apart from the coast, for example, in stabilization operations in coast countries. Military powers with a worldwide a presence of maritime power protection actually would like to enforce access to all the areas along their sea routes. So who has the power on the sea? How is it possible that the West how can it secure its rights on the sea, both in times of peace and war? What I would like to point out first is that the daily competition of powers, so this is the security political routine, is not described very well by the term peace. It is the fighting for the supremacy in the world and also on sea. It's a permanent process that mostly is non-violent, sometimes with subtle vices, or only in exceptions is carried out with by the form of war, and the interlinking of land and seas becoming ever closer. The ocean, the categories peace, crisis, and war are not suited to describe the permanent power struggle on the sea. The fighting for sea control and sea denial is actually a whole range of activities that are blurred. They reach from peaceful conflicts of interests until all the way to power demonstrations and saber rattling, all the way to violent conflicts. The legal system is an instrument of power. The old Western sea powers, the English and the Spanish, the Dutch and the Portuguese, since the end of the 19th century, also the Americans, have developed a Western law of the seas, and instruments like the Convention on the Law of the Sea and courts of law, especially the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, are the latest institution. There are different ideas of laws, and they all actually include a number of means, all the way to lawfare powers that actually have not secured their interests within this framework, have challenged this order, but their successes so far have been limited to their own coastal areas. Nobody has managed so far to actually come up with an alternative to the Western order on the sea. In addition to the internationally recognized rules, the Western powers, of course, also have a physical prominence. This is countries like the US and their allies. There are a couple of other larger partners in the Pacific area, such as Japan, Australia, and South Korea. The South China Sea shows how China is trying hard with a combination of physical power and its own interpretation of the laws to secure the power over the large areas of the sea. On the one hand, they exercise permanent presence, which is important. They create artificial islands to dominate the sea routes and sea areas, and they may deny the free access. This procedure is flanked by their own interpretation of international laws. The majority of states actually which have accepted the Convention of the Seas have not done so in a rigid way. There are many additional agreements, and the third convention of the law of the seas has taken into account. There are 12. There are many different economic zones, exclusive economic zones now that have been expanded all the way to 200 miles. The attempt to extend the territorial waters is not only for the coastal states to expand their economic zones. Powers like Russia and China and the US as well, they would like to make it harder for others to reach their coast. Here, anti-access area denial, A2AD, has already been mentioned. Better technical possibilities to actually dominate from the coastal is something that limits movement on the sea, and also all the denser and denser reconnaissance from the outer space that can record the surface of the seas or other factors. The combination of sensors on the surface of the sea and the space and outer space is a focus of Chinese research. The challenge is merging data of various sensors in order to get a confirmed situation on a so-called recognized picture. We have to assume that for a while submarines will play an important role. They can still operate in an unobserved manner and use the freedom of the high sea. However, that there are some countries who can afford it, they will be able to observe and monitor submarines by underwater sensors. This was already done before, but of course technology has led to smaller and more efficient solutions so that no submarine can remain unrecognized. More and more concerns are the civilian monitoring networks. Those are networks of underwater sensors or from wind turbines or that are installed along pipelines in order to record any changes. These data are available on the internet and accessible to foreign powers. So the question remains whether classical means of sea warfare with carriers, amphibious units, surface and underwater vessels are not outdated. There is growing concern that China, maybe Russia less, already have a plan to attack American superiority on the sea. And this is something that could be the elephant in the room. Are we going to see a disruptive break in naval warfare that will be even deeper than the change from the sail ship to the steamship, and followed by the change from the wooden hull to the plating of the 19th century, as the U.S., with all the modernization under, for example, Third Office, keeps to the basic elements of its power dispositives. Such a disruptive change would have to start with the challenger, in this case China. If we want to analyze disruptive technologies, it's the invisible that what is hidden that creates most concerns. And especially cyber attacks planned could actually provide knowledge on weaknesses and security gaps in the American system. The most dangerous form of the attack is the combination of soft skill and hard skill, the paralyzing of sensors and powers by a cyber attack, and then annihilating strike with missiles and torpedoes. Whoever is planning such an action has the advantage of the initiative. Nobody outside the of such an attacker knows when this will start. On the other hand, the attacker does not know, has a very limited chance to practice. Live tests are not possible. The attacker does not know if before his attack software will change. This is a risk that will remain for a while. The risk must not be neglected. Why should a power for which time seems to be working run this risk? With all this attention for cyber attacks, we mustn't forget about modern kinetic weapons that have been developed by Russia and China in the past decades. Caliber and Iskander are the buzzwords here. Anti-aircraft systems of the family S-300 and 400, super captivating torpedoes, and much more. As a matter of fact, the West has actually paid attention to the weapons development after the end of the Cold War. Russia and also the Soviet Union before actually invested a lot into the development of missiles. In view of the superiority of Western navies since the 1950s, anti-ship missiles were developed. They were installed on the coast and on small speedboats. The West woke up only in 1967 through the electric when a very small speedboat was actually firing a missile that was destroying the Israeli destroyer lot. The world woke up and began analyzing the new threat. Superior technologies also seem to have weaknesses can be used if you know them, and the longer the technologically leading West and its allies deal with the new threats, the lower their chance for success will become. Only 6 years after the sinking of the Elad, the Israeli managed to render missiles from Egypt in the Yom Kippur War ineffective. If we look at China's actual current shipbuilding program, it is pretty conventional. There are a large number of surface battleships and submarines are being procured, and one is building aircraft carriers. This means two things. China is serious about being and becoming a sea power and is actually focusing on conventional means. In their eyes, carriers and frigates will be obsolete. This is true, although China's airport carriers of Soviet production of the 1970s or are modified Me-2s. Their capacities actually are not as good as U.S. French ones, but this does not exclude that in the future China's ships will get a new power force. Yeah. In complex weapons system, we have a manifestation of leadership, and thus is the image. Western warships are designed to meet complex deployment challenges by delegating decisions to the lowest competent level. This contradicts all principles of centralistic leadership. If we copy a Western battleship, a warship, in order to use it and lead it according to other different principles, one will only have a limited use. Alternative deployment concepts required weapon systems that are differently conceived, and this we were told also by officers of the GDR Navy after 1990. And actually also supported by our observation and training. Great naval exercises are carefully orchestrated by China and Russia. They are done according to standard scripts without any room for personal initiative. But this is what gives power to the Western forces. Keeping the initiative has been one of the pillars of the NATO concept of maritime operation. China's fleet is not really prepared to be for the most conventional conflict with the largest power of the sea, but it may be that the initiative by the preemptive strike could be won by a preemptive strike. Maybe the digital Pearl Harbor is planned, and this gets me to other conflicts on the sea. Not only Russia and China can actually control parts of the sea from their coasts. For long-range missiles that get their data from satellites are available to other countries. This is also true for failed states and war worlds, but only if they have the monetary means to get that. This means that classical power protections in form of an amphibious unit becomes much more difficult. Without the support by a comprehensive range of effects from the air and from outer space, this form of operations against states with sea denial will not be possible. This means at the same time that it will be easier for neighboring states to deny the access to the sea to each other. I'm thinking of the Persian Gulf and of the South Chinese Sea. The technical possibility I have already discussed. It would go too far to talk about the possibilities of modern sea warfare resulting from artificial intelligence and robotics. At the end, I would like to sum up what I said in 7 theses. Number 1, the significance of the oceans is changing. While the goods transport via the sea may be decreasing, its significance as an energy and raw material source may grow. It is in the interest of humankind to take care of the oceans as ecosystems. 2, the of the seas to exercise power in the sea remain high. The forms of the conflicts will change. The appearance of new actors and technology. 3, the possibility of a preemptive strike against the Western powers, especially the USA, remain, but is tied to great risks and is not the most probable development. Instead, we can expect that new powers will play for time, and the corresponding change strategies might be influencing the law on the sea, and alternative interpretations of the sea might be supported by physical means. The view of cyber warfare must not divert our attention from kinetic weapons system. The West has actually paid too little attention to the missile and torpedo systems developed by Russia and China. The possibilities to deny the use of the sea to others are growing, and at the same amount it will become more difficult to project power across the sea. The defensive sea denial is actually winning out vis-a-vis the offensive sea control as far as significance goes. Accordingly, the role of classic sea warfare means is changing. They are being further developed, but they will actually belong for quite some time to the large sea powers. And in this way, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral. Those have been wonderful insights. Now we'll have Laura Ohlendorf. In 2005, she joined the German Navy. She studied at Helmut Schmidt University. She became a naval officer. And she worked on the frigate Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And in 2014 and 2015, she's been a deployment officer on the frigate Brandenburg. Since 2017, she's been head of the Helmut Schmidt University unit, and is now attending the basic staff officers presentation course. And I met Ms. Ohlendorf at another event where she gave a similar presentation, and there were conflicting interests in the High North in the 21st century, and that was published in the OMZ magazine journal. Thank you. Dear Brigadier, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost I would like to point to the fact that in the following I will be presenting my point of view and not that of the German Navy. So are the current developments in security policy new phenomena, or does this declaration as such only serve as an excuse for the Western community of values inability to create security. I will focus on narrative, and I will start with a short definition. Then I will focus on some of the security policy landscape issues. Now, what has changed? What has this new vocabulary triggered? My hypothesis is that the security policy landscape is now boundless. It is now the power of the stronger, and thus it is difficult to forecast and to make analysis. But it is those future analyses that make it possible for states to develop long-term strategies and to position themselves appropriately in the military arena. Now, the world has changed. Cyber and hybridity have entered a new era of warfare. The phenomenon of the narrative, on the other hand, has experienced a renaissance and should not be underestimated in its effectiveness and ability to be instrumentalized as a part of trade strategy. Now, in the second part of my presentation, I would like to draw your attention to the High North and take you to a long neglected area in international relations, the Arctic. Now, what is the significance of narratives in this maritime arena? What does the term narrative mean? So it's a story. Language does not only describe, it also construes reality. The narrative process is always preceded by a narrative motive. In the political context, forms of rule can be legitimized. For example, it is only with a strong hand that the people can be protected. Now, when we talk about this boundless political risk landscape, well, this needs to be based on a certain statement. So before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a balance of power in the international state system, with the nuclear stalemate of the major powers. So the security risk and variables were clearly outlined. For Kenneth Waltz, the founder of the neo-realist theory, this balance created a stable international order. The right of the strongest constituted this world order. After the end of the East-West conflict, this bipolar
das eine bestimmende sicherheitspolitische Risiko, der Angriff auf die territoriale Unversehrtheit, trat in den Hintergrund. Stattdessen rückte die Schule des Institutionalismus mit der Stärke des Rechts und der internationalen Zusammenarbeit in den Vordergrund. Doch der Sieg der westlichen Demokratien brachte nicht das vom Politikwissenschaftler Francis Fukuyama prophezeite Ende der Geschichte, das Ende des Krieges. Auf die Jugoslawienkriege in den 90ern folgten die Terroranschläge vom 11. September. Die Digitalisierung der Welt hat eine neue Dimension der Verwundbarkeit geschaffen. Die öffentliche Meinung kann durch Eingriffe im Cyberraum massiv beeinflusst werden. Mit der Annexion der Krim durch Russland 2014 kehrte das alte Risiko territorialer Kriege nach Europa zurück. Neu war die Nutzung hybrider Kräfte. Zusammengefasst haben sich eine Vielzahl sicherheitspolitischer Risiken nach dem Ende des Ost-West-Konfliktes entwickelt oder haben paukenschlagartig eine Renaissance erlebt. In der immer stärker vernetzten und digitalisierten Welt ist die staatliche Verwundbarkeit nicht mehr durch den Faktor räumliche Distanz geschützt. Der Staat tritt in seiner Rolle als einzig legitimer kriegsführender Akteur zurück. Internationale Terrorgruppen und irreguläre Kräfte der hybriden Kriegsführung erweitern diese diffuse, komplexe sicherheitspolitische Risikolandschaft. Aber die zentrale Zeitenwende wurde 2014 ausgelöst. Seitdem hat sich die westliche Weltordnung, die Bewertung der sicherheitspolitischen Risikolandschaft massiv geändert. Die Stärke des Rechts wich dem Recht des Stärkeren durch Russlands Bruch des völkerrechtlichen Gewaltverbots. Gleichzeitig rechtfertigte Russlands Präsident Putin, sein Vorgehen mit der Argumentation des Responsibility to Protect. Es ging um den Schutz der russischen Bevölkerung auf der Krim. Das Narrativ des geteilten Volkes, was wieder geeint werden muss, wird durch Putin postuliert. Wie wirkt sich diese veränderte Bedrohungslage auf die neue Bühne in den internationalen Beziehungen, auf die nasse Nordflanke, den hohen Norden aus? Geht Russland auch hier den Weg des Rechts des Stärkeren und lässt sich hier der Einfluss eines Narrativs nachweisen? Bei der Deutung der Gestalt des Interessensraumes Arktis sind 3 Sichtweisen beachtenswert. Die der Medien, die Russlands und die der Wissenschaft. Wie ist der Umgang mit dem dank des Klimawandels neu entdeckten maritimen Raumes und seiner ökonomischen Möglichkeiten? Seitdem die russische Flagge 2007 auf dem Meeresboden des Nordpols platziert wurde, wird immer wieder medial der Kampf um die Arktis, um die dort vermuteten großen Erdöl- und Erdgasvorkommen prophezeit. Russland selbst relativierte jedoch die Bedeutung der russischen Flagge am Nordpol und hielt sich an internationales Recht. Gemäß UN-Seerechtsübereinkommen kann die Wirtschaftszone um 150 Seemeilen erweitert werden, wenn nachgewiesen wird, dass der an die 200-Seemeilenzone angrenzende Meeresboden zum eigenen Festlandsockel gehört. Durch offizielle Vermessungen des Lomonossow-Rückens beanspruchte Russland 2015 so den Nordpol für sich. Russland selbst bekräftigt immer wieder den Willen zur internationalen Kooperation und beschreibt ihn als alternativlos in der Arktis. Alleingänge in der unwirtlichen Gegend haben geringe Aussichten auf Erfolg. Und gerade Russland fehlt die technische Expertise, um ohne Unterstützung an die wichtigen Ressourcen zu kommen. Gleichzeitig begann Russland mit der Reaktivierung alter militärischer Infrastruktur in der Arktis. Auf der russischen Inselgruppe Franz-Josef-Land östlich von Spitzbergen wurde zudem 2015 eine neue große Militärbasis eröffnet. Ein Einsatzkommando für die Arktis wurde aufgestellt. Eine kleinere Militärübung fand im gleichen Jahr in Sibirien statt. Das Ziel war die Verteidigung einer wirtschaftlichen Einrichtung in der Arktis. Die Arktis gehört uns. So kommentierte der Kreml den eigenen Festlandsockelantrag. Die Arktis-Expertin Dr. Katrin Keil bestätigt: Die Arktis hat für viele Russen eine emotionale, starke Bedeutung. Entstanden ist diese kollektive Identität der russischen Arktis bereits unter Stalin. In den 1930ern hatte die publikumswirksame Entdeckung und Erforschung der Arktis durch die Sowjetunion eine hohe Priorität für Stalin. Es ging um die Schaffung eines arktischen Mythos. Verherrlicht werden sollte die sowjetische Pionierleistung. Mit den Worten des sowjetischen Parteifunktionärs Sergei Kirov: "There is no land that Soviet power cannot transform for the good of mankind." Der Nordpol ist für die Rohstoffausbeutung an sich uninteressant, da dort aufgrund der Wassertiefen eine Förderung unwirtschaftlich ist. Der Großteil der Ressourcen befindet sich ohnehin in russischen Wirtschaftsgewässern.
Finally, about prestige and about the assertion of Russia's Arctic identity pushed by President Putin. The narrative, the Arctic belongs to us, clearly expresses we will not tolerate any compromise. Putin uses this what Cameron Ross called a source of legitimacy, as described by Cameron Ross, as a nationalism from above to mobilize his compatriots for his regime. Putin promises to make the Russian nation strong again, and it hits the nerve of the Russian people. The annexation of Crimea is supported by the majority of Russians. On the other hand, science talks about a conflict-free area in the Arctic, in which institutionalized cooperation prevails in the so-called Arctic Council. Russia's military armament is seen as a legitimate securing of the huge borders of the Russian territorial integrity in the military exercises as routine operations. Obviously, there is a striking difference in the evaluation of this space between the named actors and the narrative condensed from it. Battle for resources. The Arctic belongs to us, the conflict-free space. Rationally seen, cooperation in the Arctic, in view of the difficult circumstances there, has a greater benefit for all parties. Therefore, the narrative of science seems superior to that of the media. But in predicting Russia's behavior, the narrative of the Russian Arctic should not be underestimated. The use of patriotic slogans and the demonstration of military strength as a symbolic policy is an important strategy of Putin. If the decision of the Continental Shelf Commission is not in Russia's favor, military enforcement is available. And the phenomenon of the narrative is old wine, new skins. The Russian Arctic narrative already used under Stalin proves this. The rediscovery and instrumentalization through Putin of this narrative to create an Arctic identity and the associated symbolic policy can explain Russia's armament in the Arctic saber-rattling. The media effective generation of national pride is distracting from domestic political programs. If the Russian strategy in the Arctic is thus evaluated with a cool head, arms can and should be calmly counted on the wet north flank, but without losing sight of the far north and Russia's approach. Even if this narrative is an old phenomenon, the effectiveness and the ability of this part of state strategy to be instrumentalized should not be underestimated. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant, for our excursion to the High North. And now we're going to have Markus Gegner, the commander, joined the German Navy in 2000 after studying business administration. He actually worked as an officer on the frigate Hamburg, and then he was working in Friedrichshafen in the flotilla. He has experience in deployments in Afghanistan and worked in the Operation Active Endeavour and also worked in Kurdistan. After working as the chief of an local company, he has now been asked to join the General Staff College, where he is about to graduate from the 13th Joint Armed Forces Training course. General, thank you for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, since the Ukraine crisis and the rise of the Islamic State, the term hybrid warfare and the resulting risks has made it from the technical literature into the media. I would like to share some personal thoughts and include the maritime perspective. I would also like to say that these are my personal opinion, and it does not represent the view of the German position of the Bundeswehr. Also on the panel before, we heard from Sun Tsin, and I would like to come back to him, but actually to start my talk, quote, "If you know the enemy and yourself, you need not worry about the outcome of 100 battles, but if you know yourself and not the enemy, then for every victory that you gain, you will suffer a defeat." And this is a statement that's still the pillar for any strategic thinking in security policy and beyond. The crises and conflicts of the recent past have shown this in a drastic way. As the most prominent example, I would like to mention the Ukraine crisis, but also the rise of IS might be a very good example. In both cases, the international community of states was totally surprised by the combination of means used and the consequences. Therefore, early and targeted countermeasures and reactions were not done. Russia, with the annexation of Crimea, was able to strengthen its position by actually securing itself the permanent use of Sevastopol as a main base for the Black Sea Fleet, just to mention one of many maritime aspects. In addition, in the southeastern Ukraine, a conflict was generated whose end is not foreseeable at all, and in connection with the annexation of the Crimea has led to a renewed confrontation between the Western community of nations with Russia. If we look at the annexation of Crimea using open sources, we can see that the basis for this operational masterstroke was the targeted orchestration of non-conventional military procedures. Already in January 2013, the General Chief of Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, described this action as nonlinear warfare. The Ukraine crisis as a result, was the implementation of these considerations and has been described as hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare can be described best, and I quote, as the reverse of the interlinked approach, that is the orchestrated use of diplomatic, humanitarian, economic, technological, and information means for the purpose of war and not of peace. An important feature is the long concealment and obfuscation of intention and authorship. The Federal Minister of Defense, Dr. von der Leyen, in a speech in front of the Deutsche Bundestag, has shown these elements of hybrid warfare. Quote, Russia employs a mix of measures, covert operations, and open use of means, the infiltrating of intelligence officers, military personnel without any nationality markers, disinformation, propaganda, fostering of social disparities and tensions, massive deployment of troops in border regions, but also psychological forms of pressure combined with economic pressure. End of quote. How well Russia has done this to cover up the authorship and their own strategic intentions, the federal minister showed in a speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2015. She noted that only the overall view showed the aggressive character of the Russian plan. At this point, one could object that also in the past elements of hybrid warfare were used. But I'd like to note that in the recent past, now the roles have been exchanged between conventional military and hybrid elements. By the targeted orchestration of hybrid means and methods, the strategic dimension has been shifted around. The Swiss Matthias Kuster, in an analysis on the Ukraine crisis, said the following, quote, the focus has shifted to measures of political, economic, information-related, humanitarian, and other non-military kind. The use of open force, often disguised as peace missions and crisis interventions, only happens at a later point. End of quote. This is the first thesis of my speech here. Hybrid elements of warfare are not an innovation, but by their targeted orchestrated use in hybrid warfare, they play a decisive role with a strategic dimension in selected current conflicts. Hybrid threats are characterized by a high degree of multidimensionality. Future conflicts may further develop beyond the classical military dimension. And this leads to a situation where security policy analysis and recommendations will become more comprehensive and complex, both nationally and internationally. If we now look at the maritime dimension, we can say that so far land-based elements of hybrid warfare have been in the focus. The maritime dimension of hybrid warfare is only looked at marginally. This is surprising, as the use of hybrid elements on the sea and on land is a serious risk worldwide and will play an ever larger role in future. This statement was made by the retired U.S. Admiral, Supreme Allied Commander Field Admiral James G. Stavridis. In the present maritime security strategy of NATO, there is no hybrid warfare term that is mentioned explicitly. They are only touched on the side, all these terms. An updating of the maritime security strategy of NATO was actually done in 2016 by Bancroft Center at the National Security at the Atlantic Councils in order to account for the new situation. The risks and threats in the maritime field can be of manifold nature. As relates to threats in the maritime field, the use of vessels should be used. They could as weapon carriers, reconnaissance platforms, parent ships for speedboats and smaller vessels, or as a combination of these function. If they are manned with a staff that is non-uniformed and are not recognizable as combatant, this would be certainly a way to. An example for this kind of vessel is the Russian Yenter class. It can be used for various roles with hybrid threats. It could be registered as an oceanic research ship, and it may in reality be a reconnaissance platform. In addition to the hybrid risk potential in the maritime field, it's the global trade and global interlinking, including the maritime dimension, and the may lead to an increased hybrid risk potential in the maritime field. In addition to the possibility of attack on offshore wind, oil, and gas plants. The attacks on underwater cables represent a great recent disruption of the data traffic, and data flow is certainly a serious risk for all the economies and also vessels of the class used here. Furthermore, by disrupting sea routes, the energy and raw material supplies could be weakened. Last but not least, cyber attacks and sabotage measures from the maritime dimension could actually be influenced also by, could have effects on port logistics. This brings me to my second thesis, that maritime hybrid threat potentials do exist, but it has not been attempted sufficiently so far to actually draw conclusions. This is something that needs to be done as soon as possible in order to integrate insights and results into maritime security strategies and to implement counter strategies. Hybrid threats, their high degree of multidimensionality, actually is targeted against the weakness of societies and economic systems. The battles are not lost on the classical battlefield, but in the societies and their weaknesses. Within the framework of prevention, it is decisive that the risk analysis of one's own security, economic, and societal structures are being made in order to recognize possible points of attack. In addition, an analysis of capacity and situations of the opponent needs to be done. Only a consistent and continuous combination of both can do justice to the postulate by Sun Tzu that I mentioned at the beginning. This means that in addition to consistent and targeted inter and multinational cooperation, also a consistent cross-domain analysis of the situation in the international framework is required. In this way, deviations from normal behavior may be recognized. This is also especially true for a maritime domain, which plays a decisive role for global trade. Hybrid risks will be dealt with when the entire society and all the economic systems are sensitized and prepared for dealing with it. At the same time, it is important to study hybrid risks and dangers scientifically, because only in this way currently observed elements of hybrid threats can be used to forecast future threat scenarios. And this brings me to my third thesis. My third thesis is that in all domains there are domains that are explicitly, this includes explicitly the maritime dimension, and this is something that we see everywhere. The military options can be then very important. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to a discussion.
Thank you, Commander. Thank you for your presentation and the last speaker today is Rear Admiral Grimsted.
Admiral Grimsfeld joined the Norwegian Navy in 1977 and served in various assignments in the beginning in the Coastal Artillery branch. After a tour in the J4 branch of NATO headquarters North and I4 headquarters in Sarajevo, he took the position of the Chief of Staff of the Norwegian Fleet and later on as a faculty advisor at the Norwegian Defense College. And from 2006 to 2011, Admiral Grimsfeld had the position as the Commander Naval Education and Training Command. In 2011, he became the Chief of the Norwegian Navy and was promoted to Rear Admiral. In 2014, Admiral Grimsfeld decided to retire from active service, but he is still engaged in defense matters. He is still engaged in defense matters, and now I'm very happy to have you here from Norway, and looking forward to hearing your inputs from a personal and a Norwegian perspective.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your kind introduction and the opportunity for me to come here, being like a horse in a circus again. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know I'm the last one before the break, but I hope you will listen to my points. I'll use a slightly different approach than the other ones. I have a small presentation that I will give comments on during the presentation. First, a little bit about the Norwegian Navy. Norway is by population a small country, about close to 6 million people. But we have our Navy is just over 200 years old, and today it comprises of what you could say classical types of assets, with frigates, with submarines, with mine warfare vessels, with the corvettes. A new logistic vessel is coming this year, and also we have naval special forces. This structure is, as has been mentioned previously by my colleagues here, under pressure in terms of numbers, because it's difficult to replace every asset by one-to-one, but at least the basic structure will be preserved for also for the decades to come. In addition to the Navy, the Coast Guard is also organized under the Navy, but the Coast Guard operates as a conventional, well-known Coast Guard, but has a separate legislation under Norwegian law. This means that we are not using naval forces for Coast Guard operations in order to preserve the status quo or a low-tension area up in the high north. This has been a very successful policy over the last 70 years. If you look at the areas that Norway has jurisdiction over, it's huge areas. It's 7 times our land territory. It's 4 times the territory of France. More important, maybe, is that this is the world's richest fishery areas, not to mention what is described as non-renewable resources like oil and gas and minerals. However, we see now that there is an increased military activity in these areas. The background for this has been described by a number of lectures given earlier today. But also not only Russian and Norwegian military activity has increased, there's also an increase from US, UK, France, Germany and Netherlands that is complicating the picture. So we now say that we have a new normal intelligence picture up in these areas, which means that there is a significant higher activity from many actors. When it comes to fishery, I'd just like to say that over the last 20-25 years, Norway has put a lot of interest and efforts in reducing the illegal fishing in this area, and I think we can say now that illegal fishing is not a problem in this part of the world anymore, fortunately. We treat everybody who is a crook as a crook, whether he comes from Norway, he comes from Russia, he comes from UK, he comes from Germany, or any type of flag of convenience. They're all treated equally, and this has been a great success. But we have a neighbor, as you know, called Russia, and this is the largest concentration of military power in the world. Russia has the majority of its second strike nuclear capability based in these areas, and it's also their main exercise areas for their conventional naval forces. So for Norway, as a very, very small nation with such a great neighbor, it is important to develop policy, foreign policy, defense policy, our defense posture, how we cooperate in a very, very sensitive way. And I would say that this Fingerspitzgefühl that we have developed over so many years also we must say has been a success. I'm not sure whether the former State Secretary of the Foreign Affairs agrees with that, but at least from the naval perspective, I would say this has been a great success. Norway and Russia has never fought a war. There aren't many neighbors that have not been fighting a war against Russia. But of course, we follow this very carefully. The traditional Navy mission triangle or sea power triangle has, at least up to now, in strategic postures, been described that either you are doing diplomacy, you are doing maritime security operation, or you're doing war fighting. Diplomacy, meaning port visits, joint exercises, maritime security operations like Operation Ocean Shield off the coast of Somalia, or war fighting if it comes to that type of conflict. But things are changing, and hybrid warfare is, of course, one of the new phenomena that we are observing. I tried to give an example here. What type of individual is this? Is it a wet paintballer? Is it a criminal? Is it a terrorist? Or is it a special operation force soldier? And who is responsible for taking care of this guy? Is it the local police? Is it the special police? Is it a matter for the armed forces? And what law enforcement tools are appropriate and available in this situation? Another example is of a traditional ship, you might say, but what is it? Is it a cargo vessel? Is it a drug smuggling vessel? Is it a pirate vessel? Is it a refugee ship, mine layer, soft carrying vessel, or a missile launcher? I think all we who have experience from the sea understands the complexity of such a small vessel. So things are changing, and also if you include the civilian part of it, the resilience, if you have a large power outage or network outage, not speaking about the financial system, if you have a breakdown, what impact does it have on the civilian society, and also then on the efficiency of the armed forces? These are new elements also to naval officers. So my thesis or theory is that we are not facing the traditional sea power triangle anymore. We are facing more a sea power circle, where you are not, where you can change more rapidly from what you think is a diplomacy type of operation into a warfighting operation. But whatever you do and wherever you are on that circle, you have to secure your command and control authority by handling all types of cybersecurity. I think that cybersecurity is probably the largest concern for the time being. You must be sure that your national command authority, prime minister or president, or what type of national command authority you have, can communicate securely down to tactical level at all times. This is extremely important in order not to overreact in different type of gray zone situation, where you don't want to use too much force than you should, according to international law. So, rethinking strategy, I think there are some comments that are worth while, at least for my opinion. Naval officers and navies in general must operate in a much more complex environment than we did before. We must develop flexible tools and new tactics based on a high readiness approach. The warning times is close to zero. And nations, I underline nations, must have sufficient national intel resources. Nations must be able to make up their mind on their own. And we must have a cybersecurity capacity, and I think that every nation should pick the best and the brightest among the young men and women who are willing to get initially an education and then to serve in national cybersecurity communities. We must also develop modern law enforcement legislation, but we must not forget democracy, international law, and rules of engagement. There is a big difference, in my opinion, between democracy and democracy, if you understand the meaning. Nations must also have joint cross-agency analysis communities where police, security police, and intelligence resources merge and share information of course, with a legal basis for doing so. But still, we need to operate in multinational settings. But the problem maybe nowadays is who can you trust? So that was my 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention, and I'm not sure whether we have time for discussion.
Admiral, thank you very much for your insight into the Norwegian perspective. Wir haben noch so viel Zeit, dass wir
I think we have enough time for a short round of Q&A. So we'll hear 3 questions. Colonel, please. Colonel Rosewitz, thank you very much for your deliberations. I found this very impressive. I dealt with this when I was in Brussels with the EU maritime strategy. And I'm wondering, on the one hand, we have the strategic considerations of Germany and of Norway, the EU maritime security strategy, NATO considerations. So how can you reconcile all of this, and what is the significance of the European Union in terms of its strategy, and how is it embedded in the others? Microphone is apparently not working. So the development of strategy in sovereign states and organizations such as NATO and the EU are of course not done in a coordinated way. It is at events such as this one where we start forming a common opinion. The current federal government in its coalition agreement wrote a lot about expanding think tanks. We have seen in Germany that strategic thinking has not been sufficiently developed. And we, in our academy, are going to have to do a lot more in that respect. We are going to start with the first conference this week. And of course, we're also looking at what other nations are doing. And this can only be done by having an exchange, a common opinion shaping. There's no top-down approach. So we need to find a common denominator. And then we try to move forward. Thank you for these different presentations. I have a question in light of the geopolitically very difficult global situation. So if we bear in mind what's happening, where certain people question multilateralism, they are just thinking of themselves, America first, for example. So we've heard this referred to before. So that's one thing. And on the other hand, that's my question for you, how can we adapt the training of our soldiers and the education of civil society in light of these changes, these transformations? Because you see Facebook, internet, Twitter, etc. So the traditional training paths are completely overturned. So the future generations, of course, have a completely different world. Not in Germany, but also in other parts of Europe. Young people, well, some people retire, but not enough young people are coming up. So how can we attract young people? So this also applies to all other areas. I'm from Germany, for example. We don't have enough teachers, lecturers, whatever. So we are seeing all of these global processes of change and transformation. And I'm somebody who's originally from Africa, so I'm to also talk about these flows of migration. Well, we're also getting older, so how can we maybe train people differently in Europe as well as in Africa, because the world is changing. So in the past, it was the English who coined the world. They said it's learning by doing. But with all of these transformations, the new buzzword is e-learning on demand. So that's the new buzzword, e-learning on demand.
Thank you for your comment and your question. This is a very complex question you raise, sir. From a military point of view, if you, I would say that we are still the cohesion of NATO, the cohesion of EU is at least up to now looking as it's managing to handle this situation. If you take the exercise patterns and the nations that participate in the different exercises going on right now, it's as you could have seen just a few years ago. There is a normal US participation, there is a normal UK participation, there's a normal German participation, and other nations operate more or less as they've done before. When it comes to the more civilian part of your question, how do the young generation look upon this? I'm not the right guy to ask, but I think that the one problem is that these issues that we are discussing here is maybe not the one that the young generation wants to discuss. They have different view of what is going on. We are dealing with questions that we are concerned about and that we are rightly concerned about, but I'm not sure whether the younger generation of especially people in the western part of Europe have share the same view.
My name is Helmut Malnick.
My name is Helmut Malnick. I have a comment. I believe that we are facing a maritime revolution. The first revolution came maybe 152 years ago when the torpedo was invented. 50 years later, it was used. That was the replacement of the big gunship. So that was a sensation. The torpedo or the carriers were the force equalizers, as Professor Hartmann said. Now we are facing the so-called unmanned vehicles underwater and also unmanned surface vehicles. So these are fast vehicles that would be enough in order to dominate the seas. And they are, of course, highly relevant. So, of course, this doesn't preclude other fleet units, but that's imminent. So, small states, even small groups, can use computer-guided latent movement units. They lurk at some entrance or estuary to a river, and then trigger the attack in no time, whenever they wish. So that wasn't a question; it was a comment. Well, briefly as to your comment. The strategic experts, so we need to speak in a way that we understood. So that's important, education. And as to your point, yes, this is covered. The heading of coastal states can control their areas better, of course. One last question, please, General. Thank you for your deliberations. In your presentation, in the largest sense of the term, you talked about the conventional capabilities of the maritime forces. My detailed question would be, what is the strategic importance of nuclear-driven and nuclear weapons, nuclear-operated submarines in the increase of states that have nuclear arms? Well, to use nuclear weapons from a submarine is the top end of technology. So what happens to a submarine when it starts using, well, tactical strategic missiles? Well, this is not something that you can buy off the shelf. But there's another problem. If indeed the capability increases of listening to what's happening underneath the surface of the seas, then the underwater triad is at risk. If other people know where the nuclear submarines of the opponents are, and it cannot be excluded that this will be feasible in the short future, then the nuclear strategy needs to be changed in that respect. So that's kind of really interesting. So the major concerns of those countries that have strategic nuclear submarines. Right, so I'd like to thank our panelists once again for these statements that are very much to the point. Admiral, thank you. To admirals, commanders, Captain, Lieutenant. General, I would like to congratulate you on this excellent panel. Each of these presentations was brilliant in its own right. I'm very pleased because we have managed to keep the presentations short, so we had time for Q&A. Mr. Rapatz, Colonel Rapatz, will give his presentation later, and we would now like to ask for a short stretch, short break, 5 minutes, so that we can then continue with the next presentation, Militat and Krüger. Well, we don't really have a lot of time because the commander wants to do his presentation before the icebreaker. So I think that the round of questions and answers was well worth it. So 5-minute leg stretch and then come back again. Thank you. First, Mr. Rapatz.
Ladies and gentlemen, Admirals General, we have received a Tiger wine as a bottle, and we would like to present this to the panelists now. Thank you.